first part will be about the history of Jerusalem, and the second part will be on Jacob's trouble. Jerusalem, city of peace. Ha-Shalom, literally city of peace. The name of this town was Jerusalem, a word probably of Semitic origin that apparently means foundation of Salem or foundation of God. This will be a reality when God will start the new covenant with Israel after Jacob's trouble. During its long history, Jerusalem has been destroyed at least twice, besieged 23 times, attacked 52 times, and captured and recaptured 44 times. The oldest part of the city was settled in the 4th millennium BCE. In 1538, walls were built around Jerusalem under SALEM, the Magnificent. Today, those walls define the old city, which has been traditionally divided into 4 quarters, known since the early 19th century as the Armenian, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim quarters. The old city became a World Heritage Site in 1981 and is on the list of the World Heritage in Danger. Modern Jerusalem has grown far beyond the old city boundaries. This is taken from Wikipedia encyclopedias. The walls of Jerusalem. A newly excavated Jerusalem site includes a wall claimed to have been built by biblical King Solomon. The walls of Jerusalem surround the old city of Jerusalem. The walls were built between 1535 and 1538 when Jerusalem was part of the Ottoman Empire. The history of Jerusalem. You will notice on this chart or graph that you can see all the different rulers who were ruling over Jerusalem. Our primary concern would be over the Roman Empire when they ruled when Jesus was living. And then also at the bottom, you'll notice would it be at the arrow on the bottom points the Ottoman Kingdom, then when the British had part of it, then Israel and Jordan, and finally Israel. So this would just be a graph to illustrate how many different rulers have ruled over Jerusalem. The first mention of Jerusalem in Genesis chapter 14, verses 14 to 16 and 18 to 19. 14. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he led out his trained men, one in his house, 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. Verse 15. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and he defeated them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. Verse 16. And he brought back all the goods and also brought back his relative Lot with his possessions, and also the women and the people. Verse 18. And Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High. Verse 19. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. A city called Salem. In the book of Genesis, chapter 14, verse 18, it mentions a city called Salem, which most Jewish commentators believe refers to Jerusalem, ruled by Melchizedek. According to one Jewish tradition reported by the Midrash, Jerusalem was founded by Abraham's forefathers, Shem and Eber. In Hebrews 7, chapter 7, verses 1 and 2, we have two very interesting scriptures. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham and said he was returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him. Verse 2, to whom also Abraham apportioned a tenth of all of the spoil, was first of all by translation of his name, King of Peace. In verse 2, the Hebrew spelling of the latter half of the verse suggests a dual form, hence a twofold peace. Attack on Jerusalem. This would just be one picture to illustrate how many times Jerusalem was slaughtered by all of the different enemies. David captures Jerusalem. Jerusalem became a city of David, the capital of the United Kingdom, both as the secular and religious center. David brings the ark to Jerusalem with a great celebration. You'll notice on my right side, I hope this arrow will bring out the mouse here, that Israel really had a large marching band. I would like to mention in this marching band, you always think of the colleges as having marching bands, but in 1 Chronicles chapter 13, verse 8, they had all kinds of instruments made of wood, lyres, harps, trombones, castanets, cymbals, and trumpets. And it also mentioned that they did a lot of singing. And this was the wrong way to carry the ark. As you'll notice, the Levites and David should have known that the ark should not have been carried by a carriage or driven by animals. And Uzzah lost his life when he abruptly tried to put the ark back in its place when it went around a turn. So you'll notice that this is the correct way. You'll notice the little mouse here. The priests are carrying the ark like they were told originally, and David brought the ark to Jerusalem. Solomon's first temple. King Solomon built the first temple on Mount Moriah. It took 7 years and 183,300 men to build the temple. I won't read all the scriptures because you'll notice that they're all printed out for you. I'll just read the ones that pertain to scripture. In 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 3, and the Lord said to him, I have heard your prayer and your supplication, which you have made before me. I have consecrated this house, which you have built, putting my name there forever, and my eyes and my heart will be there perpetually. Very important to know that this is very important that God has put his name on Jerusalem. I'm going to expand on that as we move along. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 4, for it came about when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. That when Solomon permitted idol worship on a mountain east of Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives. 1 Kings 11:7. Hezekiah. Sennacherib and his army lay siege to Jerusalem. In 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 15, it is recorded that Hezekiah went to the temple and there prayed, the first king of Judah to do so in approximately 20 years since the time of Solomon. God delivers Hezekiah with a miraculous victory. 2 Kings 19, verse 35, tells of the angel of the Lord destroying 185,000 Assyrians. Hezekiah becomes mortally ill, and he prays and receives a 15-year extension. God defends Jerusalem for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. Jerusalem at the time of Christ. We're not going to explain much of this city as you see here, but we'd just like to point out the Garden of Gethsemane, It'll be right outside the city of Jerusalem. This would be a detailed description of the city of Jerusalem. We'd like to mention, if you notice, with the little arrow going to number 4, that would be the site of the Lord's Last Supper, and Caiaphas's home, who was the high priest at the time, would be very close to where they had the Lord's Supper. Next, this would be Golgotha. This is believed where we believe would be the skull, or where Jesus was crucified. Daniel's 70-week prophecy. This is the only prophecy in the Bible that will tell the exact time when Jesus would die on the cross. So you notice we started out with 454 and BC, and the 70 weeks would be at the top. You see 70 weeks going across the top here, and then that would come out to be 36 AD. And we realized that the 70 weeks is important. As I mentioned, this would be the time when we know that the Messiah would appear. And we'd like to mention that the word Messiah would be the anointed one. And we'd like to emphasize that the anointed one would not be one person. So we have to realize that the Messiah would consist of the anointed, which would be Jesus as the head, and 144,000. So when a person is spirit begotten, you are anointed as a propitiatory member into the body of Christ. And the arrows would point out the final week. So the final week would be from AD 29, and he would be crucified in 33 AD, and that would be the end of exclusive favor to 36. So the first 3.5 years, you could see this little arrow, would point to God's favor to Israel. And then God's favor would be to individuals until AD 36. And this is taken from Daniel chapter 9, verse 23 to 27. And I'd like to mention again that this is a very important prophecy, because this is the only prophecy in the Bible that would point to the birth and death of Jesus. Lament over Jerusalem. This is taken from Matthew 23, 37, 38. Jesus cried out, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wing, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate." And we also realized that the Jewish people in the city of Jerusalem, when he was being crucified, they said, "Let his blood be upon us." And that was a very, very terrible statement. The fall of Jerusalem, AD 70. 1 million plus Jews perish. The temple destroyed in 70 AD. The Emperor Vespasian dispatches his son Titus to lead the assault on Jerusalem. Titus reportedly refused to accept a wreath of victory, saying that the victory did not come through his own efforts, but that he had served as an instrument of God's wrath, of Philostratus. Jesus had called Jerusalem the pillar of the prophets and the stones who sent forth to her. Matthew 23:37. Jesus' prophecy concerning 70 AD. Happy are the barren women and the wombs that did not give birth. 23, 27, 29. While the Jewish population was not given the decree to leave the land, the conditions such as Fiscus Judaicus, a special tax imposed on the Jews, were grave enough to convince most residents to disperse around the globe. Ottoman Empire conquered Palestine in 1517 and held it until the emperor's decline at the end of World War I. The Ottomans, though practicing Muslims, were much less harsh on the Jewish community than the previous Islamic empires and actually permitted them to thrive. Napoleon invades Egypt. In 1798, Napoleon invaded Egypt. Though he never conquered Palestine, the European influence in the Middle East brought many reforms for the Jewish community. The full Jewish citizenship in Palestine began in 1878. And then we also have Israel double. Israel's double would be two periods of like time, 1,845 years of favor and 1,845 years of disfavor. And it was from 1813 BC to 33 and a half when Jesus died on the cross, and then it would always go to 1878. So favor and disfavor. You will notice that the 1,845 years in favor and 1,845 years of disfavor would be a like period of time. And when Jesus was on the scene going into Jerusalem, said Zechariah 9:12, this very day would mark the change from favor to disfavor. In the Jeremiah chapter 16, verses 11 to 18, predicts the conditions of disfavor, and to the right, Isaiah chapter 40, verses 1 to 2, not 12, predicts the end of the double. In Isaiah 61, verses 7 and the last part of verse 8, these are very important scriptures. It says, instead of your shame, you'll have a double portion. So that confirms the scripture interpretation of what we have is correct. That there would be a double portion, and instead of humiliation, they will shout for joy over their portion. Therefore, they will possess a double portion in their land. Everlasting joy will be theirs. In verse 8, I will make an everlasting covenant with them. So verse 8 becomes a very important scripture because it mentions the new covenant that will come to Israel. Next for our consideration, we have Benjamin Disraeli. He was the British Prime Minister. He was the chair of the Berlin Congress of Nations, 1878, giving Jews the right to colonize Palestine. So God, through his providence, made sure that he would have an individual at the right time to help the Jewish people. In 1878, Disraeli, the only Prime Minister of England, arranged for the British to purchase a major interest in the Suez Canal Company in Ottoman, controlled by Egypt. Disraeli chaired the Berlin Congress of Nations in 1878, giving Jews the right to colonize Palestine. In 1878, the first Jewish colony, Tikva, a name aptly meaning the Gate of Hope, was established by Jewish refugees from Russia. Theodor Herzl. In 1896, Theodor Herzl of Vienna called the first Zionist Congress to issue a call to Jewry everywhere to return to their ancestral homeland. Chaim Weizmann was the first president of Israel in 1948. In 1917, the government of Great Britain, through the intervention of the Jewish chemist, Dr. Chaim Weizmann, issued the Balfour Declaration, placing His Majesty's government of England on record as favoring the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. The beginning of prophecy. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration produces hope for a Jewish state in Palestine. Israel becomes a nation in 1948 with a population of 806,000. In 1967, the Jewish people own Jerusalem. Israel becomes a state. I'm sure that many of you remember the newspaper article and the headline, "The State of Israel is Born." David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, publicly pronouncing the Declaration of the State of Israel, May 14, 1948, Tel Aviv, Israel, beneath a large portrait of Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern political Zionism. Population of Jerusalem by community. This is just a graph to illustrate how the population of the Jewish people has grown. We started out in 1885 with 15,000, and in 1967 we had 195,000. This column would represent the growth of the Muslims, and we end up with 281,000 Muslims. And then there would be Christians in Israel, 14,000. But the point we'd like to rule now is that the Jewish people had the rulership over Jerusalem since 1967. And this becomes a very important point because the Lord will not fulfill the prophecy against Jerusalem until the Jewish people would own Jerusalem. In 1948, when Israel became a nation, there would be 800,000, 6,000 Israelites as a nation. And in 2002, you'd have approximately 9,152,100 would be the present amount. But that would include not only the Jews, but also all of the Muslims. Jerusalem. This would be the beginning of our prophetic future. Jacob's troubles recorded for us in Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 7. Alas, for that day is great. There is none like it. And it is the time of Jacob's distress, but he will be saved from it. You notice that we underline that day, and that's very important because we realize that the definition of a day could be 24 hours, it could be a year, it could be 40 years in the wilderness, it could be 1,000 years as a millennial day. What we believe the Lord is telling us is that that day is going to be a short period of time. And this day would be the start of the end of the permission of evil. So 2 parts of Jacob's trouble. Israel, part 1. The nations attack Israel for its spoil. Ezekiel 38, 11, and 12. And you will say, I will go up against the land of the unwalled villages. I will go against those who are at rest, that live securely, all of them living without walls, and having no bars or gates. Verse 12. Capture spoil and to seize plunder, to turn our hand against the waste places which are now inhabited, and against the people who are gathered from the nations, who have gathered cattle and goods, who live at the center of the world. We realize that God will deliver Israel. In Ezekiel 38, verse 23, and I will magnify myself, sanctify myself, and make myself known in the sight of many nations, and they will know that I am the Lord. We're going to consider part 2, which would be our discussion for this time. That would be Jerusalem part 2. And we read in Zechariah 12:1. And before I read that, I'd like to mention that God reviews creation and the permission of evil, and he prepares us for the final attack on Jerusalem. So in verse 1, we read, the burden of the Lord, the word of the Lord, who stretches, we have that underlined for a specific reason, he stretches out the heavens, lays the foundation of the earth, and forms the spirit of man with it. This is not a picture of part of the universe, but it is a drawing which would very fitly represent that in this area here would be the beginning of the Big Bang. And you will notice that Hubble was the first one who helped revolutionize astronomy when he discovered that all those little dots that you see in the sky are not necessarily stars, but many of them are galaxies. So these are galaxies, and they are leaving from the Big Bang. And depending on the color that you see here, this would be red, and some very close by would be in the blue, would be the speed of galaxies. So the galaxies are traveling at different rates throughout the universe. So this is a larger picture to show that all of the galaxies are going away from the Big Bang, and the Big Bang is no longer a theory. The Big Bang has been proven by the antenna from the radio antennas and also from the satellites that went out into outer space. So the question would be, why are we talking about this? Well, we believe the Lord is setting the time setting for Zechariah 12:1. That we're going to go from the beginning of this Big Bang Theory all the way to the end of the permission of evil. I have a quiz now for the brethren. How many books of the Bible support the Big Bang Theory? So would it be A, 0, B would be 1, C would be 3, and D, 5. So we're going to give you a minute to see what your conclusion would be. The correct answer is 5. And I'm not going to read all of these scriptures, but you'll notice that the answer would come from Job, Psalms, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Zechariah. And Brother Meganson, in his notes on Zechariah, brings out the fact that he used these scriptures. So I don't know if Brother Meganson, it's wonderful that he has these scriptures, because you would not get these scriptures unless it be from a scientific textbook. But the point that we're trying to emphasize here, that the word stretch that we use in the Bible is in a past, present, and future. So the universe is still expanding out from the very beginning. So again, we like to repeat that God is telling us that Jacob's trouble will not come until that day. We're going to emphasize it. Jerusalem prophetic. Zechariah chapter 12, verses 2 and 3, we read, "Behold, I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling all the peoples around. And when the siege is against Jerusalem, it will also be against Judah." Verse 3. "And it will come about in that day." Now you notice that we're going to start emphasizing in that day. So we're talking about a relative short period of time. "That I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all of the people, and all who lift it will be severely injured, and all the nations of the earth will be gathered against it." Zechariah 14, verse 2. "Well, I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured, and the houses plundered, and the women ravished, and half of the city exiled. But the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city." So Zechariah describes the last humiliation of the Jews. In Revelation chapter 19, verse 7, this is the New American Standard. Let us rejoice and be glad and give the glory to him, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and the bride has made herself ready. We realize that Jacob's trouble, and I'm sure we're all going to agree with this, cannot come until all of the Spirit begotten individuals are taken off of the earth. So that would include all of the little flock, all of the little company, great company have to be taken off, because when we read now about in that day, this is going to be the final scene or stage or scenario, whatever we'd like to call it, when we have the end of the permission of evil. So in Zechariah, in chapter 12, in that day is mentioned in verse 3, 4, 6, 8, 9, and 11. And then also in Zechariah chapters 12 to 14, it's mentioned 16 times. So in that day becomes a very important element or part of trying to interpret correctly Jacob's trouble. Zechariah 12, verse 5 and 7. Then the clans of Judah will say in their hearts, a strong support for us are the inhabitants of Jerusalem, through the Lord of hosts their God. Verse 7. And the Lord will save the tents of Judah first, in order that the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem may not be magnified above Judah. It's very important that those scriptures are mentioning about Judah and Jerusalem. This is a key promise of prophecy that was mentioned in Genesis 49:10. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the people. So it's very important that we realize that Judah and Jerusalem have to be delivered first. And in Psalms chapter 89, verses 3 and 4, this would be just a few scriptures to represent the sure mercies of David. In verse 3, we read, and I have made a covenant with my chosen. I have sworn to David, my servant. I will establish your seed forever and build up your throne to all generations. Zechariah 12, verses 8 and 9. In that day, the Lord will defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the one who is feeble among them in that day will be like David, and the house of David will be like God, and the angel of the Lord before them. And it will come about in that day that I will set about to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. Prophetic. This is a suggestion which I believe, and I hope it'll be accepted by you to whatever extent possible. I don't mean to be comical, but this is a strong suggestion. The clans of Judah are the ancient worthies. You have a similar situation in 2 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 20. Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, was going to be attacked by Moab, Ammon, and others. Jehoshaphat summons a fast throughout Judah, 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 4. And Jehoshaphat offers a prayer. So the prayer of Jehoshaphat is recorded for us in 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verses 6 and 7 and 12. So this is the prayer of Jehoshaphat, and we believe this would be the prayer of the ancient worthies. In verse 6, and said, O Lord, the God of our fathers, art thou not the God in the heavens? And art thou not ruler over all the kingdoms of the nations? Power and might are in thy hand, so that no one can stand against thee. Continuing in verse 7, didst thou not, O our God, drive out the inhabitants of the land before thy people of Israel? and give it to the descendants of Abraham, thy friend, forever. Verse 12. O our God, wilt thou not judge them? For we are powerless before this great multitude are coming against us, nor do we know what to do. But our eyes are on thee. So the ancient worthies are going to pray to the Lord that you promised this land is our land, and we want you to fulfill this promise. God's answer to the Jehoshaphat would represent the ancient worthies. 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 15. Listen, all Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and King Jehoshaphat. Thus saith the Lord to you, do not fear or be dismayed because of this great multitude, for the battle is not yours, but God's. In 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verses 17 to 24, verse 17. God is speaking. You need not fight in this battle. Station yourselves. Stand and see the salvation of the Lord on your behalf, O Judah and Jerusalem. Do not fear or be dismayed. Tomorrow go out to face them, for the Lord is with you. Verse 20. Jehoshaphat stood and said, listen to me, O Judah and inhabitants of Jerusalem. Put your trust in the Lord your God, and you will be established. Put your trust in his prophets and succeed. Verse 21. And when he had consulted with the people, he appointed those who sang to the Lord and those who praised him in holy attire. And as they went out before the army and said, give thanks to the Lord, for his loving kindness is everlasting. Then on the fourth day they assembled in the valley of Barakah, for there they blessed the Lord. Therefore they have named that place the valley of Barakah until today. Verse 27, and every man of Judah and Jerusalem returned with Jehoshaphat at their head, returning to Jerusalem with joy, for the Lord had made them to rejoice over their enemies. Verse 28, and they came to Jerusalem with harps, lyres, and trumpets to the house of the Lord. Zechariah chapter 14, verses 12 to 13. Now this will be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the people who have gone to war against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they stand on their feet, and their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths. Sounds like God's going to use a supernatural power. Verse 13, and it will come about in that day that a great panic from the Lord will fall on thee, and they will seize one another's hand, and the hand of one will be lifted against the hand of another. Zechariah 12, verses 8 and 9. In that day the Lord will defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the one who is feeble among them. In that day will be like David, and the house of David will be like God, and the angel of the Lord before them. Verse 9, and it will come about in that day that I will set about to destroy all nations that come against Jerusalem. Zechariah 14, verse 3. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. Zechariah 12, verses 10 and 11. And I will pour out upon the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication, so that they will look on me, whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son, and they will weep bitterly over him, like the bitter weeping over a firstborn. Verse 11. In that day there will be a great mourning in Jerusalem, like the mourning of Hadad Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. In Zechariah chapter 14, verse 9, we read, "And the Lord will be king over all the earth. In that day, the Lord will be the only one, and his name the only one." In Zechariah chapter 8, verses 20 to 23, we read, "Thus saith the Lord of hosts, it will yet be that the peoples will come, even the inhabitants of many cities, and the inhabitants of the one will go to another, saying, Let us go at once to entreat the favor of the Lord, and to seek the Lord of hosts. I will also go." Verse 22, "So many peoples and mighty nations will come to seek the Lord of hosts in Jerusalem, and to entreat the favor of the Lord." Verse 23, "Thus said the Lord of hosts, in those days." Now you notice that the tense has changed. It's not in that day or those days, excuse me, it could be in those days, so we're changing the tense of the days. In those days, 10 men from the nations of every language will grasp the garment of a Jew, saying, "Let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. And I will set my glory among the nations, and all the nations will seek my judgment, which I have executed, in my hand which I have laid on them." 2, "And the house of Israel will know that I am the Lord, their God, from that day onward." Verse 23, "And the nations will know that the house of Israel went into exile for their iniquity, because they acted treacherously against me, and I hid my face from them. So I gave them into the hand of their adversaries, and all of them fell by the sword." Notice in verse 23 where it says, "I hid my face from them." And this could be confirmed in Deuteronomy when God said that he will hide his face from Israel because they disobeyed him. And in Acts 3:19 to 21, we have the word "close upon," that the return of our Lord would really be the face of God or Jehovah is turning toward mankind. So the thought of the face in verse 23 is very, very important. When God said, "I hid my face from you." God is with you. Zechariah chapter 8, verse 23. "Thus said the Lord of hosts, in those days," you'll notice that the tense is changed. "In those days, 10 men from the nations of every language will grasp the garment of a Jew, saying, Let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you." I like this translation much better. It would be one of my favorite. And this is Zechariah 8:23 again. And for our sentence says, "Thus said the Lord of hosts, in those days," the tense is changed, "10 men of various languages of the heathen will encourage themselves and seize the hand of a Jew and say, We will go with you, for we hear that God is with you." I like the thought of the hand of the Jew for the simple reason that the hand is really a means of greetings and communication. Whenever we meet anyone or in different meeting, we extend our hand. So our hand would be a form of a welcome, also a form of welcome and in friendship. Zechariah chapter 14, verses 16 to 19. This is talking about the Feast of Booths. When Israel was leaving Egypt, they lived in tents and in booths in the wilderness. Verse 16. "Then it will come about that any who are left of all the nations that went against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to celebrate the Feast of Booths." Verse 17. "And it will be that whichever of the families of the earth does not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them." Verse 18. And if the family of Egypt does not go up or enter, then no rain will fall on them, and it will be the plague with which the Lord smites the nations who do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Booths. This will be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all nations who do not go up to celebrate the Feast of. God says he has chosen Jerusalem as the place where he has put his name forever. So we realize that the new covenant will be in Jerusalem. It'll be the capital city of Israel. And God has put his name on Jerusalem. It is confirmed for us in 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verse 6, chapter 33, verse 7, Psalms 46, verse 4, 48, verses 1 to 8, and 87, verse 3. Jerusalem will be the capital city of reconciliation. Jerusalem will be the capital city of the new covenant. We have shalom for our last word. I'd like to put in a strong recommendation that during our New Year's May convention on the internet, Brother Jerry Monette gave a wonderful talk on shalom. It was very well done, very scholarly, and he brought out how many times and different definitions of shalom could be used throughout the Bible. It's very interesting, and I'd recommend it. That would be Brother Jerry Monette, and it was a wonderful talk. And may the Lord bless these considerations.